Hello everyone, welcome to the first online class session of Software Requirements Analysis and Specification, which is Unit 2 of the 5th semester course called Software Engineering, having the course code 15CS51T for the program called Diploma in Computer Science and Engineering from the Department of Collegiate and Technical Education, Karnataka. The agenda of this online session is to discuss about the introduction to software requirements analysis and specification, value of a good SRS, requirements process, problem analysis or requirement analysis, requirements specification, and the desirable characteristics of an SRS. The main goal of this unit called Software Requirements Analysis and Specification is to develop an understanding of the basic concepts and principles of requirements engineering. A software requirement, which we simply call as a requirement, is a condition or a capability that must be possessed by a system in order to satisfy a contract or a standard or any other formally imposed document. A software requirement is a functional or a non-functional need to be implemented in the proposed software system to achieve an objective or to solve a problem. But understanding software requirements is quite a difficult task. Identifying and specifying requirements necessarily involves people interaction and analysis of existing system. Therefore, it is very essential to do a proper analysis and specification of requirements. The outcome of requirement phase is a document called Software Requirement Specification, which is popularly known as SRS. SRS plays an important role in the development of proposed software. Now, let us try to understand the importance of an SRS in the development of proposed system. The major parties or the stakeholders involved in proposed system for which requirement analysis and specification is to be carried out are the client, the developer, and the users. The problem is that client usually doesn't understand software or the software development process, whereas the developer often doesn't understand the client's problem and application area. This causes a communication gap between the stakeholders involved. Therefore, SRS plays a very important role in establishing an agreement between the user and the client. Based on SRS, the final product can be validated by the parties. That is, keeping SRS as the reference, proposed software can be checked for the fulfillment of the requirements specified. Therefore, a high quality SRS is a must to produce a high quality software. As well as a high quality SRS minimizes the development cost. This is because fixing of errors is much less during requirements phase compared to the later stages in the software development. Let's understand the requirement process now. It is a process wherein a series of activities have to be performed for the sake of converting user needs into software requirements. This process basically consists of three steps. 1. Problem analysis or requirement analysis. 2. Requirement specification. 3. Requirements validation. Requirements process is depicted in this figure. As we can see, requirement process is not a linear sequence of activities. From specification activity, we may go back to analysis activity, and from validation activity, we may go back to analysis and or specification activity. And this overlap of activities and feedbacks may happen quite often until we obtain a final validated SRS. As we can see in the figure, analysts extract user needs, convert them into software requirements, and then they specify these software requirements. The specified requirements are validated with the client by discussing it with them several times. Through a series of these overlapped activities, we obtain a final validated SRS. Problem analysis require a lot of effort and attention from the development team or the analyst team in order to extract proper requirements. Analysis focuses on the problem domain to understand the desired or the proposed system, its requirements, its constraints, etc. Analysts need to carry out a series of meetings with the clients and the users. They have to conduct several interviews, surveys, etc. and they have to study the existing system and its related documents like user manuals. Divide and conquer is the best strategy for performing analysis, wherein analysts decompose the problem into smaller parts and then they focuses on each part and the relationship between these parts. Other techniques like data flow diagrams, object diagrams, etc. can also be used for analysis. Well, requirement specification is a very important step wherein all the software requirements are supposed to be documented precisely and care must be taken not to skip any of the requirement. That is, all the requirements must be documented completely. Requirement specification is written based on the data gathered and the knowledge acquired during analysis phase. But transition from analysis to specification is not straightforward. During analysis, a lot of data or a huge amount of data is gathered. Organizing this data itself is a key factor. Analysis focuses on problem structure and many of the required situations as well as constraints would not have been given attention during analysis phase. This is because analysis does not focus on external behavior of the system. Therefore, extracting required data and constraints from analysis is not so straightforward. Specification phase itself is a major task and is relatively independent. Let us consider an example of an online flight management system. The requirement specification here must contain flight details, customer details, and reservation details. Flight details must include the originating flight terminal and the destination terminal, along with the stops in between, the number of seats booked or the number of seats available between two destinations, etc. Whereas the customer details may include the details like customer code, name, address, phone number. And if there is any other details to be gathered about the customer, that could also be included. This information may be used for keeping the records of the customer for any emergency or for any other kind of information. And next, the reservation details may have the details like customer details, code number, flight number, date of booking, date of travel, etc. These are the minimum requirements to be taken care of in the online flight management system. Along with this, many other specific requirements are taken care of. So this example gives an overview of how a requirement specification could be for a flight management system. After requirement specifications are developed, the requirements mentioned in this document are validated. User might ask for illegal, impractical solution, or experts may interpret the requirements incorrectly. This results in huge increase in cost if not nipped in the bud. Requirements can be checked against following conditions: if they can be practically implemented, if the requirements are valid and as per functionality and domain of the software, if there are any ambiguities, if they are complete, if they can be demonstrated, etc. The requirements elicitation process is as shown in the figure, wherein the requirements gathering phase, the developers discuss with the client and end users and know their expectations from the software. During organizing the requirements, the developers prioritize and arrange the requirements in order of importance, urgency, and convenience. Negotiation and discussion is done if there are any ambiguities or confusions or conflicts present. If requirements are ambiguous or there are some conflicts in requirements of various stakeholders, if they are, it is then negotiated and discussed with stakeholders. Requirements may then be prioritized and reasonably compromised. The requirements come from various stakeholders. To remove the ambiguity and conflicts, they are discussed for clarity and correctness. Unrealistic requirements are compromised reasonably. Documentation. All formal and informal, functional and non-functional requirements are documented and made available for next phase processing. Now let us have a look at the various desirable characteristics of an SRS. A good SRS must have these following characteristics. It should be correct, complete, unambiguous, verifiable, consistent, and should be ranked for importance and or stability. Now let us try to understand each of these characteristics. Correctness. An SRS is correct if every requirement in the SRS represents something required in the final product precisely. Each requirement should precisely represent some desired feature supposed to be possessed by the software. Next is completeness. An SRS is complete if all the requirements a software is supposed to do are mentioned or specified. Every required feature or characteristic or functionality or an operation must be specified. Next characteristic is unambiguous. A requirement is unambiguous if it has only one meaning to it. Therefore, every requirement in the SRS should have exactly one meaning. Every requirement should have been specified in a way that it is verifiable by some means in a cost-effective manner to in turn ensure that the final software meets the requirement. If the requirement is specified in this way, then we call the requirement as a verifiable requirement. Each and every requirement specified in the SRS should be verifiable. Next characteristic is consistent. An SRS is said to be consistent if no two requirements of the SRS contradict each other either logically or temporally. That is, there should not be any logical or temporal conflict between the requirements. Ranked for importance or stability. An SRS is said to be ranked for importance and stability if the importance and the stability of each requirement are specified. This characteristic helps in selecting the requirement for an iteration based on the ranking. Therefore, this factor plays an important role in iterative development of the software. This also helps in reducing the risks associated with the project. Now let us consider an example of an educational software system. Here, student can get registered for different courses. Here we are considering three columns. The first column indicates the desirable characteristic of the SRS. Whereas the second column mentions the bad requirement and the third column mentions the good requirement. So let us have a look at the first characteristic, that is completeness. Each and every requirement, as we already know, should be complete. For example, here the bad requirement says a professor user will log into the system by providing his username, password and other relevant information. Here the other relevant information is not clear. So, the other relevant information should be spelled out in good requirement to make the requirement complete. So, to rectify this bad requirement and make it a good complete requirement, it can be specified as a professor user will log into the system by providing his username, password and department code. Now the requirement is complete and is meaningful. The second characteristic we are having a look at here is unambiguity. As we know already, each and every requirement should be unambiguous. So here for instance, we have requirements. A student will have either undergraduate courses or postgraduate courses, but not both. This is one requirement. There is some other requirement that says some courses will be open to both undergraduate and postgraduate students. The problem in this requirement is that from the first requirement, it seems that the courses are divided into two categories, undergraduate courses and postgraduate courses, and student can opt either of two but not both. But when you read other requirement, it conflicts with the first requirement and it tells that some courses will be open to both postgraduate and undergraduate. Therefore, it is obvious to convert this bad requirement into good requirement, which is a student will have either undergraduate courses or postgraduate courses but not both, which means that every course will be marked either being as undergraduate course or postgraduate course. The next characteristic we are going to look at is consistency. No two requirements in the SRS have conflicts with each other. They should be consistent throughout the SRS. But here in the example, the total intake of admissions have been specified as 70 by one statement and the other statement specifies it as 72. Therefore, they have conflict here with each other and the total admission intake requirement is inconsistent here. Obviously, it has to be rectified to make it a good requirement by changing the total intake to either 70 or to 72, whichever is relevant. Now, this requirement is made as total intake admissions allowed are 72. So, now this becomes consistent. Now, let us have a look at the verifiable characteristic of SRS. As we know already, each and every requirement in the SRS should be verifiable. Here the bad requirement is each page of the system will load in an acceptable time frame. Now there are two problems with this requirement. First is that each page, meaning that there can be many pages which going to blow up the testing efforts. The other problem is that it say the page is going to load in acceptable time frame. Now, what is acceptable time frame? Acceptable to whom? So, we have to convert the non-testable argument into a testable argument. That is a non-verifiable argument into a verifiable argument, which specifically tells about which page we are talking about, like register student and enroll courses pages, and the acceptable time frame is also given, which is 5 seconds. So the conclusion we draw from this example is, this is how we have to look at each and every requirement at appropriate level. For example, if we are going to build a software with regards to system and integration requirements, we have to look in the system and integration requirements given in the software requirement specifications or user stories and apply to each and every requirement quality. Then check whether each and every requirement is complete, unambiguous, consistent, verifiable, and so on. So now let us have a brief recap of what we have learned in the session. The very purpose of requirement process is to produce SRS, which specifies the client's requirements precisely and which forms the basis of software development as well as validation. And we have learned that requirement process involves three basic activities: requirement analysis, requirement specification, and requirement validation. The goal of analysis is to understand the different aspects of the problem, its context, and how it fits within the client's organization. Whereas in requirement specification, the understood problem is specified or written, which in turn produces the SRS. And requirements validation is done to ensure that the requirements specified in the SRS are indeed what are desired. And finally, we had studied about the key desirable characteristics of an SRS, which are correctness, completeness, consistency, etc. Now let us try to answer some of the multiple choice questions. The first question here is, software requirement specification, that is SRS, is a document that 1. Describes the complete behavior of the software, 2. Describes the design of the software, 3. Forms the basis of an agreement between the client and the supplier. So your question here is, which of the above statements is or true? A. 1 only, B. 1 and 2 only, C. 1 and 3 only, D. All of the above. I hope you know the correct answer for this question. Will you please try to answer this question? Yes, the answer for this question is option C. That is, software requirement specification is a document that describes the complete behavior of the software as well as it forms the basis of an agreement between the client and the supplier. The next question is, which of the following statements are true? 1. Validation step overlaps with the analysis and specification steps. 2. Specification step overlaps with the analysis step. 3. all the steps in the requirement process are linear. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? Option A, 1 only, B, 2 only, C, 2 and 3 only, D, 1 and 2 only. So what is the correct answer for this question? Yes, the correct answer for this question is option D. It is true that validation step overlaps with the analysis and specification steps, as well as specification step overlaps with the analysis step. Your next question is analysis step of the requirement process. 1. Focuses on the problem structure. 2. Does not focus on external behavior. 3. Does not focus on many constraints. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? A. All of the above. B. None of the above. C. 2 and 3 only. D. 1 and 3 only. Will you please try to answer this question? Well, the correct answer for this question is option A. Yes, the analysis step of the requirement process focuses on the problem structure, but it does not focus on external behavior of the system as well as most of the constraints present in the system. The next question here is, an SRS is consistent if option A, all the requirements for software are not of equal importance. B, all the requirements for software are of equal importance. C, every requirement stated does not change with time. D, there is no requirement that conflicts with another. Do you know the correct answer for this? The correct answer for this question is option D. An SRS is consistent if there is no requirement that conflicts with another. So the next question is, ranking of an SRS for importance and of stability helps in the selection of requirements for iteration, helps in selection of the requirements for modification, helps in selection of the requirements for incremental development, all of the above. So what is the correct answer for this question? Yes, A is the correct answer for this question. Ranking of an SRS for importance and of stability helps in selecting the requirements for iteration. That is, it is helpful for iterative development. So the next question is, an SRS is unambiguous if A, every requirement stated has no dependency. B, every requirement stated has one and only one dependency. C, every requirement stated has one and only one meaning. D. All of the above. What is the answer here? Yes, the answer here is C, option C. An SRS is said to be unambiguous if every requirement stated has one and only one meaning. So the next question is, SRS plays a very important role in establishing an agreement between the user and the supplier because 1. Software development process is complex. Software design process is unknown. Clients usually does not understand software or the software development process. 3. Developer often doesn't understand the client's problem and application area. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? Option A, all of the above. B, none of the above. C, 1 and 3 only. D, 2 and 3 only. What is the correct answer for this question? Yes, the correct answer here is option D. That is, SRS plays a very important role in establishing an agreement between the user and the client because client usually doesn't understand the software or the software development process and developer often doesn't understand the client's problem and the application area. So the next question is, an SRS is correct if option A, every requirement included in the SRS represents some valid inputs. Option B, every requirement included in the SRS represents some valid outputs. Option C, every requirement included in the SRS represents something required in the final system. Option D, none of the above. So what is the correct answer for this question? Yes, it is option C. An SRS is correct if every requirement included in the SRS represents something required in the final system. So the answers for all of the above questions are specified or mentioned here. You can have a look at it. So the source of reference for preparing this online session are the textbooks Software Engineering, A Precise Approach, Pankaj Chalote, and A Concise Introduction to Software Engineering by Pankaj Chalote. I hereby would like to thank the author of these textbooks, Mr. Pankaj Chalote, and thank you everyone.